India-China studies is a re-emerging field, I think, and let me congratulate all three emerging scholars for their wonderful presentations. And within that context, let me tell you about the importance of Dhriti. In India, I think there are 4 or perhaps 5 people who can read classical Chinese, and which means that most people can't read anything written before 1950s because they were using traditional characters, and there's a dearth of scholars who can do pre-1940s China, and Dhriti is one of them. And so I think people like her have to be promoted, and I think I have to thank India-China Institute for bringing her here. The importance of her topic is also something very significant. 5th century for Buddhism in particular was very important. There were 2 reasons that Dhriti doesn't go into. One is expansion of trading activities in Asia during this time, and the other is state formations that are taking place throughout Asia. And that results in coming up with these monastic institutions, which is something the Buddhists really created, a parallel institution to the state. And in order to have these monastic institutions, you needed rules to govern these monastic institutions. And Vinayas are these rules, how to run monastic institutions. More than that, how do you become a monk? What rules do you follow? Precepts, that's very important. Even for the lay people who want to follow Buddhism, you need to know what exactly you have to do as a follower of Buddhism. So the Vinayas are basically the rules of being a Buddhist, not only just monastic institutions. So I think in order to understand this 5th century and the monastic institutions and the rules that the Chinese were struggling to get, it's very important to get to know what's happening with regard to the Chinese importing, not only the Chinese, but later on the Southeast Asians, Japanese, and Koreans, these monastic rules. And the other thing that Dhriti also does not mention is that there are different kinds of monastic rules in India. Which one do you follow? It becomes a very important debate in China. So there are 4 or 5 leading schools. Which school do you follow? So that becomes an important issue. So let me point out 3 issues. This is the first time I'm actually reading something that Dhriti wrote and heard her speak. I want to comment on 3 issues. One is related to technical issues about the paper itself. I mean, this is to improve the paper. The second is about the content with regard to what are the things that could be done and should not have been included, perhaps. And the third one is a basic issue with Chinese studies in India, which is do you write for audiences in India or do you write for global audiences who are aware of many of these issues? So who is your target audience and the value of your scholarship? That's a broader thing I think emerging scholars should be aware of. As far as technical issues are concerned, I think there are a couple of issues. The quotation that you pointed out, Yuan Nian, is year 1, right? It's not year 2 in your translation. So you have to correct that. And even if you know traditional Chinese characters, you use both simplified and traditional in your paper. So you have to either use traditional or simplified, whichever you want. Other technical issues: name of monks, Futu Chang. You don't Futu Tang. You don't call him Tang, right? And so those are some of the minor technical issues. As far as content is concerned, I think. You talk about relics a lot. I don't think that's very relevant in this case. The issues between the monastic laws in North and South China is very important. You can't take China as a whole, as if it's modern China. There are differences, local differences, and Kumarajiva, who actually works in northern China, comes in 401, plays an important role in introducing Vinaya in northern China. And some of the things going to South China are not coming necessarily from India, but from northern China. So the links are not wholly between India and China. There were no India and China at that time, but among the Chinese itself. I mean, there's a whole thing going on. I think the state formation issue is very important. You know that the Han Dynasty declines in the 3rd century, and until the 7th century, there's no unified China as such. So these smaller kingdoms and rulers, what are they doing? North and South China, I think that needs to be brought up as a historical context to the things. State identification, state formation, and the use of Buddhism is very important from the Liang Dynasty onwards, as you know, perhaps. So I would rather focus on the state formation issue rather than relics. The other one is I Ching in the 7th century, who also goes to India and talks about Vinaya. And so between the 4th and 5th century and the 7th century, things haven't changed much. Even with the introduction of the Vinayas, I Ching goes and sees that the monks in India are practicing Buddhism very differently than the Chinese. So what happened? I think you need to explain that. The wider context, this is perhaps in the last 2-3 minutes I want to talk about this. One of the things we had to do as PhD students at Penn, anybody doing Chinese studies, I think, in the US, especially those doing pre-modern China, had to learn 2 years of Japanese. And the reason for that was to study Japanese scholarship. And here, the global context of your paper really is a major shortcoming, because the Japanese scholars have already done a lot of work on the precepts. And this would include Hirakawa Akira, for example, Ocho Enichi, but particularly somebody called Sato Tatsuken, who has written a book called Chugoko Bunkyo ni Yokeru Kairetsu no Kenkyu, which is the study of precepts in Chinese Buddhism. But most importantly, somebody who has written exactly the same article as you, Toru Funeyama, who has written in English an article called The Acceptance of Buddhist Precepts by the Chinese in the 5th century. And he talks about many of the issues. I think that will perhaps make your article irrelevant because it has already been written. And this is a major problem. And I've done, Anil knows, a workshop in India where making a bibliography is the first step to find out what exactly has been done. And then you decide what exactly can you contribute given on what has been done. And so that's why I think if you look at the wider context going beyond India, and in India, not many people work on your topic, but globally there are many people working on your topic. So I would say that after you have read this article and these books in Japanese, if possible, then I think perhaps you will come up with a different issue where state formation and commercial activities could be included, which Funayama does not really deal with. So with that, I'll stop my comments. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I did want to say at the outset here, I've had the pleasure to now hear all 3 papers, 2 of them last fall at conferences in Delhi and Beijing, and then one, Anil's, a year ago when we kind of saw it over via Skype. And today, I'm happy to, I don't know if I can get that to go blank, but anyway, I'm happy to comment on the latest version of Anil's paper. I commend him for undertaking a really important question. The issue of perception and misperception is frequently talked about in studies of international relations, of course, not just China-India relations. And it's really not adequately theorized. At what level do perceptions or misperceptions matter? Is it the elite level? Is it the mass level? Is it the global level or other levels? He summarized the paper well in the time he had, basically noting that this is how China strategically perceives a rising India, that it's China's strategic perspective that he's focusing in on. And he goes through what he says is China's traditional orientation, a strategic perspective on India, and then discusses these 4 factors that led China to change that strategic orientation toward India. He says also, he said in his presentation and several times in the paper, that in many ways this is a coming of a full circle, that China's thinking towards India looks today now about what it did in the late 40s or early 50s, although of course you have to put 1949 in there in the Chinese case, and it may even offer an opportunity to ask, how did the nationalist regime, 1927 to 1949, view India? Obviously, India was important in many ways in the Second World War. The Britain-U.S. alliance, very complicated set of issues. But what we're, as a person who, as a scholar who likes to historicize things, I'd be interested in knowing what your reaction would be if you looked at some of the comments about how China was perceived, before the CCP. But obviously, I know your focus is on the present. The sources for the paper, as you mentioned, are English language articles and journals that come out of various think tanks and publications in mainland China. Emphasis on English language, of course. There's a whole raft of Chinese language sources, and maybe that's something you're working on or not yet interested in engaging. But even if we just limit it to the English language sources coming out of China, these can be online, these can be official think tank publications. I think that as one looks closer at these sources, you may come up with a much broader view, a much more divided set of strategic orientations and perspectives, so that your title is not strategic perspective singular, but maybe plural. I happen to be one, and I looked at this a very long time ago in a kind of review essay that I published about 12 years ago now. And my point in that was that there are many competing perspectives, well, in both China and India, I was arguing, but especially in your case, I think I'd like to hear if you want to, in your reactions to our comments here, if you want to continue to say that there is a singular strategic perspective, that maybe there's some differences, yes, but you've looked at the sources carefully enough to conclude that really it's small, insignificant differences, and that there really is a homogeneous view. Now we can get into that kind of epistemological questions and political questions about why would there be a singular view being foisted out there in the English language, for the global audience, in terms of representing a Chinese view of India. But I think even then, to me, as I read it, it's more diverse. And it's not just hawks versus doves. It's not just foreign ministry versus military, civilian versus military. It's a lot more complicated. And I haven't even raised the question of whether we want to look at the views of the mass public, of corporations, of others who have stakes in or interests in. But I know, as you said, you're adopting a realist perspective, and realists generally maybe entirely look at the state level and not these other non-state levels. But I do want to say, in concluding couple of minutes, that the paper's foundations being in realism, I personally have, I'm not a realist. I have problems with some of the assumptions that realist thinking adopts, primarily that the state is the only actor. So we have sentences about China decided, China has this interest, India did this, that all kinds of state behaviors and decisions are, a realist would say, explainable by something was in India's national interest, something was in China's national interest. And then, of course, there's the conception of human nature in realism, which is self-interested, security-seeking, rarely, if ever, cooperative, but we don't need to go into that here. I will say that, and I'd like to ask you to address in the response, why is it that the 1998 nuclear tests by India are, as you put it, a grand strategic masterstroke? This seems to me a kind of classic realist claim that, oh, well, look how well it turned out. India's rising now because, in 2012 and 13, because of these tests that took place in 1998. I think you could argue that, at one level, the tests maybe do raise India's status. The U.S. imposes sanctions quickly, but then with the Bush administration does a nice kind of exemption from the entire international nuclear exchange and production regime. But do the tests in any way alter China's perception of India? I know you claim that they did. Chinese officials were suddenly forced to pay greater attention to India. But I think in terms of a grand strategic masterstroke, you could argue that India has a lot more problems to deal with as a result. Some of the things you talked about, China encircling India in the neighborhood, maybe China's reaction to the tests lead in the long run to problems for India. And then finally, what about just the counterfactual? Had India never conducted these tests in 1998, would it still be rising today? Would it still enjoy the soft power status that it has? Would it still enjoy the economic growth, et cetera? And I think the answer is yes, but maybe you want to argue differently. And finally, I have more to say, but I'll just leave it that I still am not persuaded by your argument and the evidence that you present that China is really all that worried about India. It would behave, I think, it would constantly raise the issue of the nuclear weapons and tests and so forth, were China really that worried. I think the Chinese government, that is much more worried about Japan and the U.S. and India still, even in many ways like pre-1998, takes a back seat, and maybe unfairly so, but takes a back seat in terms of China's strategic thinking. But I'd enjoy hearing your comments about that. Thank you.
I put my critique in the form of a table because Zhang Xing's paper presented a lot of information, and it wasn't until the conclusion that he brought it all together and it made sense to me. And so this was the basis from which I decided to present my critique. First of all, I commend you for putting together a great deal of information that is not generally available. So my table lists your argument, and then the blue part is my question or my critique. Do I do this? To begin with, the paper compares the, oops, just press close. The paper compares the Chinese state and the Indian state vis-a-vis their relations with national oil companies. So really, the unit of analysis is the state. And the argument is that the Chinese state is, quote-unquote, more mercantilist, whereas the Indian state is, quote-unquote, more liberal. I have problems with these terms because I don't think that they are precise enough. Mercantilism was a term coined by medieval states before the industrial era, so I don't think it's quite appropriate, even though there is a general sense of collecting power and wealth, but it's a very different situation today, and so to use that archaic term seems to me rather strange. Why do you not use a more recent term like corporatism? Because corporatism does take into account the industrial landscape in which the state, local capital, and labor have to work together. And this term was initially developed for post-World War II European states that developed what is now known as the welfare state. Nonetheless, this framework applies to the East Asian states that have developed rapidly in a capitalist way, and which China has taken lots of strategic and policy characteristics from. So one could say that the Chinese state today is a corporatist communist state. And not mercantilist. Similarly, to label the Indian state as liberal creates all sorts of confusions here, because to call a state liberal evokes all of this philosophy of liberalism that the Indian state does not have. And when you refer to the Indian state as less assertive, more indirect role in the economy, that's not to say that it's liberal. It might have neoliberal characteristics, but that does not make India a liberal state. These definitions are important because they create unnecessary confusions. It seems to me you're really talking about the international political economy of the national oil companies and how they behave domestically and internationally. And you provide a very interesting take on the situation in China, which is that there seems to be a competitive regulatory structure combined with a fragmented bureaucracy that leads to intense competition among Chinese NOCs, both domestically and internationally, for commercial gains. But the institutionalized personnel control allows the Chinese state to retain effective control. This argument actually resembles some aspects of early post-war European corporate states, for example, like the Netherlands. The Netherlands has an extremely successful nationally owned energy company called DSM. It was originally called Dutch State Mines, but they had a transition and changed it into a natural gas company in the 1980s, and it subsequently became a very successful energy multinational corporation internationally. And so it seems to me that a closer comparison for your analysis would be some of these European corporate estates and how they developed and changed over time, which would then suggest that you need to make the arrows that you showed initially in your graph not one way but both ways. In other words, as the corporation interacts more with the international environment has an impact on the domestic political economy. It's not just one way. It's not a one-way street, no matter how much the Chinese state wants to make it seem like it. Comparatively, when you talk about the Indian state not relying on institutionalized control mechanisms, willing to allow the NOC conflicts to escalate into public space, thereby descending into elite conflicts and interest politics in the public sphere, you don't give an explanation for it. You just state it. And so the comparison seems skewed and shallow. The result is you say that there's faster global expansion for Chinese NOCs, but Chinese NOC competition increasingly an impediment to Chinese national interests. This seems to contradict your later statement about how this is a measurement of success. And you say comparatively the Indian NOCs are more risk averse and so they're not expanding. Again, you don't give the reasons for it. Your overall argument seems to be this two-part that you summarize at the end. Global expansion is more successful when, one, the state's geopolitical ambitions are better aligned with NOC commercial interests, and two, political mechanisms are in place to coordinate NOC international business strategy. Well, this immediately evokes the history of U.S. oil companies in the Middle East, particularly with how they made sure that geopolitical ambitions and NOC commercial interests are aligned, particularly with the CIA instigating coups all over the place. The most fantastic ones were in Iran in 1953 and in Chile with overthrowing the Allende government. And so then this leads one to question your implication that, the so-called state capital nexus, which other people call corruption and cronyism, reflects long-term convergence of a capital logic and a territorial logic, which leads to the establishment and maintenance of any hegemonic power. Yes, but if we look at the history of U.S. oil companies in the international political economy, we see that the huge mess in the Middle East politics today is a reflection of that alignment of hegemonic interest. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Sen. You've been my greatest inspiration anyhow. You know that, how you've inspired me individually. And every time I want to finish this paper, you're given more and more tasks. So now I have to look into I thought, okay, I get comments, now I can arrive at a conclusion. Now you say I have to look at so many more things. Okay, so I have overlooked state formation, as you said, throughout Asia. That is something which I have not worked on. Also, when you mentioned about the technical part, I completely agree. Yuan Nian, that was written, that was a misprint, I would say, or how would you say that? A scribe made a mistake to copy that. So that was a mistake. That's why I mentioned it as the second year, because second year was the real year there. Regarding content, when you said that relics are not that relevant, I don't know why I feel that Fashian's Parinirvana Sutra translation, as you mentioned about Nie Tao Chen, who had also done that translation in 4th century. I feel Faxian had also a lot to contribute in popularizing the relic veneration cult. And somehow when I went through your work intensively, I found that this relic veneration cult played such an important role in how the political leaders legitimized their political power. And I feel there is a connection somehow with Faxian's translation, and how he mentions, if we go through his itinerary, how intensively he mentions the relic veneration cult that was prevalent in all of these 30 different Central Asian kingdoms. So I will again convince you maybe another 1 year later with Faxian's contributions there. But I really have to look into the matter which you said, that China was not this consolidated political entity, but it was more northern China, divided kingdoms, southern China. And it's so difficult with such scarce sources to find out how these northern kingdoms actually communicated with the southern kingdoms, and how Buddhism disseminated from the north to the south, and in what capacities and what percentages, how it happened. It's also difficult. Japanese, yes, I did 2 years of certificate course in Japanese and Tibetan. I've forgotten both of them. I'm so stuck with Chinese, so I don't know what to do. But of course, I'll go through Toru Funayama's work also. And what else? The basic issue that you said was, yes, my target is the global audience, because there are just a very few scholars working in India, and we don't have exposure to the larger world. So we have to get in touch with, especially Japanese scholars, because we have sufficient English materials at our disposal, but not Japanese. And Chinese I can read, but Japanese, Tibetan, I will surely give you a better presentation next time. Thank you so much.
Okay, on this multiplicity of strategic perspectives, actually I was exactly working on this this aspect, because I myself question, absolutely you are right, even in strategic perspectives there is multiplicity, and I was exploring that question while I was preparing myself for this. So when I go back, I will definitely incorporate that. So that's well taken. China, India. Okay, on China not taking India as seriously as Japan or the United States. The thing in a different, I will be to answer this question. For example, look at this scenario. If the Chinese media start denigrating all their neighbors simultaneously, what the impact they will create? So it doesn't mean that if India doesn't figure into their strategic thinking, it doesn't mean that India, they are not taking India seriously. So there's some strategic underpinning to that thought. And also, look at when Panetta came to India in September last year, there was huge coverage of that visit. There was so many articles. For example, people were saying India won't be a linchpin in the American strategy of pivot to Asia. There was huge amount of literature. So I don't buy this argument that India is not figuring into their strategic thinking as seriously as I'm trying to project. It does figure, though they don't make it public, and there's a strategic argument for that. On this 1998 nuclear test grand strategic master stroke, actually the problem with the timeline that I have chosen, which is 1998, it gives a very misleading sort of information. People say because India conducted nuclear tests, it became rising India. It's not like that. Pakistan also conducted nuclear tests in 1998. Did it become a rising Pakistan? So the thing is, post 1998, India took an array of measures in a quick succession. For example, first nuclear test. Second, there was a paradigmatic shift in its foreign policy. From non-aligned, 4 decades of non-alignment, India became a multi-aligned country post 1998. There was a second move. The third was India made so many changes in its institutional. India made so many institutional arrangements. For example, post 1998, first was like National Security Advisory Board. We didn't have one. National Security Council, Nuclear Command Authority. Just like Chinese have a second artillery, we developed Nuclear Command Authority. So many things, and most importantly, the last point on this. The most important change was reorientation of India's geo-strategic construct. By that I mean, before 1998, India used to be South Asia bound. It was like a contained within South Asia. But post 1998, India started behaving like the British Raj. It's like behavior. For example, look at when did we move into South China Sea for the first time? October, November 2000. We conducted nuclear tests on military exercises with Vietnam and South Korea. So what I'm saying is that India's geostrategic construct started changing. So there were so many things happening post 1998. It was not just because of nuclear tests. North Korea also has nuclear weapons. Is it a power? I mean, rising North Korea? No. Nuclear weapons does not mean you great power. There are so many things. Nuclear test was just one of the component of that move, late 1990s. Thank you.
Responsibility, and we'll open up the floor for questions.
Thank you, Professor Lim, for the very sharp comments, and particularly appreciate the table. It actually helped me to think through the causal mechanism in my own paper, which to a lot of the scholars in social science would call the undetermined research design, right? Because they're basically two countries, although 6 firms, but they're basically two cases. But I have tons of variables I try to explain. So I think this is definitely a timely reminder. I need to think through the causal mechanism much more carefully. I have maybe some response to the several key concepts you raised in the comments. And I do agree with your comments, and the mercantilist may not be the best concept to describe China. But I'm also hesitant to use corporatist, because the classic corporatist incorporate the idea of state, labor, and capital. State, labor, and capital alliance and some compromise. But at least in this sets of firm, as well as the other key industrial sectors I'm going to examine in my overall projects, labor actually play a minimal role. There's no, at least at this stage, there's no significant labor involvement. So that's why I tend to call these different emerging economies more or less along the line of state capitalism. And that actually relates to the next conceptual question raised. I think this is also a very good reminder how much should I attach the importance to the success story in the end. Again, success, I agree with you, probably is not the best way to describe the outcome of the whole causal mechanism. But what I mean is all these countries are involved in the post-Cold War international system, no matter whether they are the nominal democracies as Russia, or a long-term established democracies as India, or a self-claimed socialist state. They are more or less working towards the same overall goal to sustain, help, and promote the both domestic and international accumulation and expansion of capital. In that sense, I tend to call these states more or less along the line of state capitalism. So success maybe is defined or determined by the degree of state capital alliance in promoting the domestic and international accumulation and expansion of capital in that sense. So, and Chinese and overseas behavior since the middle 1990s can be a expression of relative, more effective capital expansion, Chinese national capital expansion in the global markets. So in that sense, we might call it not necessarily success, but more effective in that sense. Normatively, whether it's good or not, I'm not making a claim in this paper, but it's something maybe worth deliberating in the next stage of the project, particularly when one bring in some other key factors, for example, labor, into the analysis. Also, the examples we bring, particularly the Dutch state mine, also the U.S. National Oil's involvement in the Middle East are all great examples. I think probably it will be very helpful to do a comparison across different dimensions. Not necessarily the same period across national oil firms from the same period from several emerging economies, but across over time comparisons of different regimes, a cooperation with the national oil company or national capitals in a historical dimension. That would be very helpful. I think that's a very good suggestion. And totally agree with you. There's tons of holes in the causal mechanism I haven't thought through. I would look forward to more conversations and comments from people who are more familiar. For example, the Indian case, which is totally new territory for me, as to how to fill in these holes, particularly the specific details of state national oil company, or more broadly state capital relations in post 1991 India. So I look forward to more comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Okay, open to the floor for questions. When you ask a question, could you just quickly introduce yourself too, so people will know who's asking? So are there any questions from the floor? Yes, just introduce yourself.
I am Yan Yifei from IGIDR, and I'll be presenting my paper in the afternoon. And I want to raise a question on Anil's paper about the soft power and hard power you mentioned. And I think your paper is primarily assessing Indian rights from a realistic or security perspective, as you mentioned. But since you also mentioned the soft power like human resource or Bollywood, and I think these aspects you mentioned actually transcends just the strategic dimension, which also contains kind of economic and cultural dimensions. So relating this point to your point that hard power cooperation among the government security is still backed by a kind of profound mistrust or a misperception. So how do you see the prospects that this cooperation in these soft power economical cultural levels can help crack down that kind of mistrust?
Right now?
Go ahead.
Okay. Actually, I myself explored this point when I was incorporating soft power while using realism as a lens. It was like it's not fitting into the picture. So I really appreciate. Sorry.
Use that.
Your comment.
Yeah, you can respond. For recording purpose, I think it is.
Do you want me to stand up?
Yeah, it's because they're recording it. So
Yeah, maybe we should have the three.
maybe you guys just come up with because we don't have a portable mic.
Can you talk using him back microphone?
Why don't you come here too? Then we'll all sit up in the front here. So let me switch with you so you can closer to the mic.
That mic doesn't work. Oh, it doesn't work. This way.
So on this soft power, yes, the realists don't understand what is soft power. So I myself question this point, but the justification for incorporating soft power is this. I realize that even the soft power is adding to this competitive dimension of Sino-Indian relations. So that is basically the rationale. Though I do concede this point that realists don't understand soft power, but because it's adding to the competitive aspect of Sino-Indian relations, that's why I took this point. And your question as to how can soft power help improve the climate between Sino-Indian relations, perhaps this is a question. Okay, I have something different take on this question. It can happen in two cases. One, either China becomes a democracy or India becomes a single party state.
Any other questions? Okay, yes.
I have a question.
Just introduce yourself.
My name is Liu Jie from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And my question for you is that in your speech you mentioned that you have your research resources from the Chinese newspaper Global Times. I don't know how you like this paper. In fact, in China, this paper is of very poor reputation. It is just generally regarded by general scholarship as a nationalistic newspaper or rightist or the ultra leftist newspaper. So even Chinese scholars, when they write papers, they do not really take materials from the global times. I would say that the Chinese journals like South Asian Studies by my academy, and South Asian Studies Quarterly by Sichuan University, and South Asia and Southeast Asian Studies by the Academy of Yunnan Academy of Social Sciences. I think they are better journals in China, reflecting Chinese think tanks' views towards India, towards China-India relations.
Okay, just to shall I? Because the first thing, why did I go for Global Times, China Daily? Because they are easily available. So this is one justification. Okay. And second is again the two articles that I have mentioned. One is China International Studies. Okay, it's published by CIIS. Another is Contemporary International Relations, and it is published by CIR. Again, same issue, same logic. I didn't have the access to the journals that you are mentioning. I should pursue for my study. So these are two easily available journals in India. So so there is the logistical aspect is the problem for that. I do agree that I should also look into other publications. Yes, point well taken, sir.
Yes,
I'm Anil, and I'm from Nepal, so somewhere in between. But this is a general question for all three of you. But it's about the motive, right? Getting up early in the morning and writing this paper that you're working on. And I'm just wondering, so whether it's the decline of Buddhism, say, at different times in different places, or the way we look at U.S. banks and their failure, or the romanticism with Arab Spring, or so there were perceptions, some time back. And I was just wondering, for all three of you, like, say 10 or 20 years down the road, how will somebody use those papers, to actually, get to those desired things that we all desire? I mean, say an Asian century, right? And so, are there lessons, from the oil and gas experience? Are there experiences from, the decline of Buddhism, or, the perceptions of, how we looked at Arab Spring? And then will your paper be able to, be a little futuristic, instead of just looking at the information that we have?
Okay, we'll ask each of you to respond. Let's Dhriti first, and then Johnson, and then Anil.
The problem is what we do is because we are stuck with it. I did my master's in contemporary Chinese studies, and I was doing post-Mao China, and I happened to come across this itinerary, Fashian's itinerary, and suddenly one of my senior scholars in India said, "No one takes up Buddhism. Why don't you go for it? There is no money, there is no hope, but if you're not asking for it, then please go for it." And I wanted to be a real good girl, so I said, yeah, sure, I don't need money, I don't need fame, I can just take it up. And look where I am now. I have to prove the relevance of my paper. I don't know whether it's futuristic, but I would say that relations is a very complex idea. So yes, we can look at China as a suspect which is rising, a kind of a fear of growing China, looking at it from a competitive mindset. But at the same time, if you go through these relations, when you go through Buddhist interactions that the two countries have had for thousands of years, you feel there is something more. It is a food for the soul, if it makes sense. And people who will have that kind of a need inside of them, they will read these papers just to think, even if it is old, there used to be a string of friendship somewhere. So it's just 5,000 years of cooperation and just 50 years of competition, so it stands stronger in the balance. That's what I would say.
John, why don't you go ahead while I ask Anil to
First of all, I will be extremely honored if 30 years from now someone is still reading my my paper. And as trained as a social scientist, we're very hesitant to make any predictions or take any futuristic stance. But I think to respond to your question, first of all, somehow I'm always interested in power and the control of different types of power. So the state-capital relation is always something fascinating. I studied economics before I moved on to political science. So the interaction between state power and different types of monies or monetary power has always fascinated me. Actually, as I mentioned, India is a totally new territory for me. I wrote my dissertation on state-capital conflict in post-privatization Russia. I was primarily motivated by the story between Russian state and some of you might know the former tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky. So this is just a fascinating story to me. Then I developed that into a dissertation. But on a more broadly or theoretical perspective, I'm extremely interested in the way capitalism as a system change over time, and whether it will the form and the pattern that will keep in its future evolution. And I quote several times in my paper, as Lillian also mentioned in the comments, the Italian sociologist Giovanni Arrighi's work. The concept of logic, capital logic, territorial logic is directly taken from the long 20th century. And he also has another more futuristic book on Adam Smith in Beijing, celebrating the uniqueness of Chinese capitalism and the possible extremely positive implication China means to the global capitalism future. I'm personally much more pessimistic on that, but I hope my ongoing research, whether in 30 years people will still read it or not, to some extent, in most marginal sense, will draw at least some implications. Whether the rise of this group of people, not only in China, but a set of so-called emerging economy or emerging countries, do possess something new to the whole global capitalist system. I have actually a working paper on what I call emerging economies and the 3 rounds of state capitalism. And the subtitle is, I haven't figured out the best way to formulate it, is something about whether we see something really new. As I originally was very optimistically tried to describe China. So that's something I'm working on, and hopefully, if not 30 years, 3 years from now, if we have a chance to meet again, I'll present some of the final results from this ongoing project. Thank you for your question.
Very quickly on this point of the futuristic dimension of my study. Yes, again, I explored this question myself. As I was mentioning in my article, there is a circle repeating in the case of Sino-Indian relations. So it can recur in the future as well. For example, there can be another perception change on the part of China vis-a-vis India. So it can happen. So that is a futuristic dimension. And also, on this perception and reality, this thing, my view is that perceptions are more important than reality. Because irrespective of reality, what is in your mind, that impacts your decision making. So perceptions are very important. And I can give you other, again, on futuristic dimension. As a realist, I see China and India like they are prisoners of geography. Prisoners of geography, in the sense that even after 30, 40 years, I don't see they are behaving in a different way, because you can't change geography in 30, 40 years or maybe 100 years. So they are the prisoners of geography. Anybody who sits in Beijing or New Delhi, they have to reckon with the reality of geography, whether it is 30 years from now or 130 years from now.
Why? Why is geography so important?
But the states can become independent, right? I mean, political geography has changed over the past 120 years or 200 years.
So, yes, a good point. Your point about more political entities, this is what. In fact, this is the argument that Alexander Wendt has made. He says that until and unless we have one single global state, geography will keep us fighting each other. He's for a global state.
No, you're wrong. Sorry.
No, I can. Okay, let me explain what I mean by this. You know, as if we have more than one political entities, there will be different political military centers who can use power. And if we have a global state, all the concentration of military power will be with that state. So in that case, that particular state can act as a global leviathan, or he will be the sole legitimate authority of unleashing violence. So this is his argument of global state.
I'm sorry.
That's Waltz, not Wendt. Right?
No, it's Alexander Wendt.
I'm sorry.
Constructivist.
You've made a categorical mistake.
Please.
Because your claim is that geography determines everything. But then you resort to a status explanation. A state is an institution. It is not geography. My question to you is, why is geography all determinant?
Yes. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for raising this question. You know, if you see India-China geographically, given the Chinese dependence on energy, it has no choice but to go to Africa, Asia, West Asia. 80% of its energy supplies passes from states of Malacca. So I'm not saying whatever they are doing, they are trying to contain India. They have no other alternative but to source their energy from Indian Ocean region. And please also remember, in a Chinese case, energy security is related with their economic security, and their economic security is directly related to their political security, which means. Your answer as to why is geography. So this is what I'm saying, because China has to go to Indian Ocean to source energy supplies. But the thing is, once China comes into Indian Ocean, then India, as you can imagine safely, India has to be concerned. Though Chinese are not doing for containing India, just to source energy supplies, but because India always has historically seen South Asia, Indian Ocean as its quote-unquote strategic backyard. So this is what I'm saying, ma'am. Or also from the Indian side, India also has to diversify its energy sources. That's why it's going to South China Sea. So this is what I mean when I say they are the prisoners of geography.
But Constance's point is appropriate here, which is that you're presuming that the nature of the economy remains the same, even after 100 or 150 years. Mm-hmm. And we know that that is not the case. Also, you are presuming that the reliance on energy remains the same even after 100 and 150 years. We know that is also not the case. A third presumption you're making is that technology remains the same, and we know that is not the case even in 50 years. So all of your assumptions fall apart when we examine them closely.
That's why we should not predict what will happen in 20 years.
To hear from a man who works in thousands of years. That's fine. Mark.
Okay, I have a question for Sine about the oil companies, and especially in your talk, is it the thing you're trying to explain is it that graph where China is successful abroad in terms of there's more shading, India less so, or is it the kind of corporate governance and business state relations pattern that varies across the two cases? That's one, is just trying to get you to pinpoint more specifically what is the outcome that you're driving at with all this really great information. And then a second more specific question is, we know that the organization department of the Chinese Communist Party can phone up the CEO of any of these oil corporations and say, tomorrow you're no longer the CEO. In your research, I mean, this can come across to an uninformed reader or observer as, oh, this is the party exerting its ultimate power over personnel control. But at another level, maybe it isn't such a bad idea to keep economic power from, spilling over into broader realms. And so I'm curious as to your assessment of whether that practice is an example of just arbitrary political control over capital, or is it is there a better explanation for it, such that this is the state trying to prevent crony capitalist relations from ensuing? And then maybe a third, if I can, in terms of the profits and the money the revenues that are generated by these two sets of national oil corporations, the revenues go to, do we know how these revenues are distributed? My basic understanding is that, at least in the Chinese case, they're not distributed to the shareholders as much as they are to the state, because they belong 90%, 80% to the state. So what does the state need these revenues to engage in infrastructure projects, engage in redistributive policies? And so if you could speak a little bit about what this possibilities for redistribution exist with these both sets of corporations.
Well, thank Mark for these very good questions. I think the ultimate dependent variable, if I may call it, in it, because the original sort of explanatory framework actually at least had two or three steps. So what you mentioned is both the ultimate dependent variable in the causal chain and the step right before that. So the pattern of state corporation or state capital relations across nations is both is something I want to explain, and use something I want to use to explain the ultimate business performance in global expansions. But that does create some problem how I should execute the empirical part, particularly when the second part is the state capital interaction, or the different national patterns of state capital interaction, whether I treat it as something I want to explain, or whether this serves mostly as a independent variable I want to use to explain the ultimate result. Yeah, this is something I need to specify more clearly in the paper. As to the personnel control, at this stage I don't know the detail. I think this is a great question. I don't know the detail, not even in the Chinese case, let alone the Indian case, which I know much less. I want to know, for example, in the paper I briefly mentioned, the personnel control right now is the ultimate or the only formalized mechanism. But there might be some informal mechanisms that are even more powerful, more effective. And this is something much harder to assess. But even at the formalized mechanism, from outside, I don't have a very clear picture. What are for example, criteria the state or the personnel department in the Central Committee of the Communist Party, what type of set of criteria they use actually to evaluate the performance of these top executives? I don't know whether that kind of list exists or not. I only know there are competing criterias, and there's sometimes there's some internal turf wars going on between, for example, the personnel department of the parties from the party side, the state commission of the National Commission of State Assets, and the National Commission on Development and Reform, the Fagaiwei. These, as part of the fragmented bureaucratic system I mentioned in the paper, they all have some overlapped authorities over these large strategic national champions. So the only thing I know now is there's some turf wars going on between these three, particularly these three committee level bureaucratic or party organizations. But as to what kind of specific criteria they use to evaluate the performance of these firms, not only national oil firms, but the list of strategic national champions, I don't know. Whether they used it competing on different set of rules. That's something I would like to get a more insider perspective when resources become available. But it's a great question. I need to look into more details. But I just want to emphasize one point. The pattern I tried to describe, and also a set of questions the two professor just mentioned, apply not only to the oil sectors. It applied to a set of key industries that I'm going to explore later. finance, infrastructure, automobile, also steel, a set of sectors. The question you raise all apply to these sectors. These are possibly the next steps in my overall research project. And the last question is also something I would like to know more detail myself, but I haven't gained good access to the details. The overall picture is there are ongoing debate whether these firms, not only oil companies, but also a set of national champions, how much they should contribute in the form of tax, and how much they should share the profits with the state as a shareholder, rather than a business contributing tax to the Ministry of Finance. There are ongoing debates which way the state should rely more exclusive as the main way to extract business profits from these basically state-controlled national champions. And I think the policy debate is still going on. This is also something I'd like to, probably have to explore in detail later. Same thing goes for the Indian side. Thank you for the question.
Just 30 seconds. Just
30 seconds.
Economy can change in the future, service and all that. You know, if you see India, China, they were agricultural economies. Now they become industrial economies, and very future they will become services oriented as well. But the thing is, the reliance on the oceans has not diminished. So you and also please also remember, during the Libyan crisis, Chinese Navy evacuated 30,000 Chinese. Similarly, India evacuated some 20,000 Indians.
By air, not by sea.
Just a minute. No, Chinese. Okay, I'm on that point. I'm not sure, but Chinese Navy for the first time stationed in the Horn of Africa, they evacuated 30,000 Chinese. So what I'm saying is, so they evacuated 30,000 Chinese, and also as their economies develop, they have to not just source energy; they also have to sell export their goods through Indian Ocean. If you read Robert D. Kaplan's book, Monsoon, he says, even in the 21st century, oceans or sea route provides the most cost-effective way of transporting the goods and services.
Thank you. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody. Well, let's just leave it here because it's already after 11. Thank everybody, the panelists and the paper givers and the questioners and the discussants for a really provocative session this morning. So, thanks.